Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Janet Marchabroda, and I'm the president of Alliance for Cell Therapy Now. We're an independent nonprofit organization that is led by academic and research centers, industry, and organizations representing patients who are working together to advance the availability of both safe and effective regenerative medicine and cell therapies for patients in need. Today, we'd like to talk about the urgent need for federal funding of clinical trials that explore the use of these therapies for seriously ill patients with COVID-19. We're delighted to have a very distinguished group of researchers in the field that will talk with us today. I'll just walk through them. Dr. Joshua Hare, who is the Lewis Lemberg Professor of Medicine, and the founding director of the Interdisciplinary Stem Cell Institute at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine is joining us. Also, Dr. Joanne Kurtzberg, who is the Jerome Harris Distinguished Professor of Pediatrics, Professor of Pathology, Director of the Marcus Center for Cellular Cures, a Director of the Transplant Program and the Carolinas Cord Blood Bank, all at Duke University Medical Center. She's joining us today. Maria Milan serves as the president and CEO of the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine. And finally, Dr. Wenxin Xu is the associate professor at the Mayo Clinic College of Medicine, Vice Chair of Research and Innovation in the Department of Pain Medicine, and Director of Regenerative Pain Medicine at Mayo Clinic. He also chairs the Enterprise Spine Research Committee. So they will be speaking with us today. Here I've got a quick overview of the agenda. Following these remarks, Dr. Hare is going to kick us off, and he'll talk about the need for additional therapeutic options for seriously ill patients with COVID-19, and he'll be followed by Dr. Xu, Dr. Kurtzberg, and then Dr. Hare will speak again about what we're seeing, some early findings from clinical studies which show promising results. Dr. Kurtzberg will then talk about current levels of federal investment, and then we'll hear from Dr. Maria Milan, who leads CIRM, the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, which is a really good example of how state level funding, the state of California can really make a difference in bringing these therapies to patients. And then I'll wrap it up with actions needed. So with that, let me turn it over to Dr. Josh Hare.
The basic thesis of what we want to discuss this afternoon is that we clearly have a lot of work to do ahead of us in understanding how to treat COVID. And that as exciting and important as the vaccines are, there's still going to be many, many affected individuals who are going to suffer from COVID infection and require treatment. So just some of the basic statistics that I think will paint the landscape for you. Of the 14% of patients that are hospitalized, about a third of them, 26 to 32%, require ICU admission. Anywhere from 20 to 42% of hospitalized patients and 67 to 85% of ICU patients develop a syndrome which I think has now become a household name, the acute respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS, as a complication of the COVID infection. And Dr. Xu will show you in a few slides the scientific mechanisms by which this occurs. This continues to have a huge morbidity and burden of morbidity and mortality. I think we know that very frankly right now with this latest surge and the rise in hospitalization numbers. And it is estimated that 39 to 72% of the ICU patients still have a mortality risk. The other thing that's very important, and again, I think I think this group knows this well, is that there are vulnerable patient populations. The older individuals are at greatest risk, and underrepresented minorities also carry a greater burden of risk. On the other spectrum of human life, the children are not protected, even though the older are greatest risks. We also know that there's a syndrome that is increasingly being observed affecting children that we have dubbed the multi-system inflammatory syndrome. Could be very serious, affect the cardiovascular system of children, and can lead to mortality. In addition to the acute syndromes, we know that there can be long-lasting effects, and individuals who've recovered from their COVID can be medically debilitated for long periods of time. And this is something that we still have a tremendous amount of work to understand. So again, there's been huge focus on vaccination, lots of recent reports in the news about the great successes we've had in developing vaccines, with at least 2 applications, I think, have been announced to the FDA for EUAs. But the point we want to make is that vaccination by itself is not going to be sufficient to rid our society of this problem. And we really need to focus on therapy as well. There are few, if any, approved therapies showing significant benefit for severe cases. And our group has been very intensely focused on this, on the study of cell-based therapy, which we believe can be a potentially new modality that is broad-acting and safe, and we strongly believe needs to have further public investment in to advance our understanding of this type of therapy. Next slide, please. Again, we've our working group that's present on this call has been intensely involved in understanding what's happening worldwide, and also developing our own therapies. I'll show you some data. We've actually used cell therapy in a number of cases, and we very, very strongly advocate and believe that cell therapy shows great promise. Just to give you the landscape of what's going on, there are more than 80 review articles highlighting the potential of a specific cell type, the mesenchymal stem cell, or the MSC. There are at least 96 randomized placebo-controlled trials underway for COVID-19, 1/3 of which are in the United States, mostly within the academic research environment. The vast majority of these cell-based therapy trials do focus on the MSC, 24 of which are in the United States. There is only one phase 3 trial actively underway right now, that's sponsored by Mesoblast, an Australian company, but they've certainly received great notice for this, this program, and they have just announced a relationship with Novartis, which is a up to $1.35 billion deal that will partner Novartis with Mesoblast to commercialize and manufacture their cell product, which is an MSC-based product for the use of ARDS, primarily for COVID-19 ARDS. Now, the emerging data can be seen in 17 published clinical studies that show, very importantly, safety, including in vulnerable populations. So this is a very safe therapy, and suggestions of efficacy, which we'll talk a lot more about in the next few slides. Dr. Xu will talk about our recent systemic review and meta-analysis that he led, which was published earlier this year, supporting safety and a positive trend towards outcome for ARDS. Now, our primary message today, and the key thing we're advocating for, is the important necessity of large-scale randomized placebo-controlled clinical trials. These trials are designed, they are ready to go, and these trials can very rapidly provide the answers that we need, but we have a major barrier in that there is presently a very significant lack of federal funding for clinical trials. And we would like to strongly see public support that is akin to sort of what the Novartis Mesoblast deal has suggested is what's required to get this done. So with that, I would turn over to my colleague, Dr. Xu.
Thank you, Dr. Hare. So as you said, the call for a large-scale randomized controlled trial is based on the findings that demonstrate the safety and potential benefit of cell therapy for COVID-19. The mechanism of the cell therapy for COVID-19 is based on the reversal of a severe inflammatory processes that affect the lung function and can cause respiratory failure and death. When SARS-CoV-2 affects a person, it invades the lung and cause a exuberant inflammatory processes in the lung that cause the fluid to fill the lung that prevents oxygen exchange and therefore respiratory failure and potentially death. Cell therapy are based on the cells that are extracted from the bone marrow, adipose tissue, or umbilical cord. These are the most common cell sources, and these cells are culture expanded in number where they are transplanted to the patient, most commonly by intravenous infusion. Once the cells are transplanted into the patient, the cells, based on their function of inflammatory modulation, based on the T cell redirection and conversion of the macrophage from a pro-inflammatory to anti-inflammatory subtype, and then the production of the anti-inflammatory molecules. So the whole cellular and molecular process of a anti-inflammatory type that causes that reduces the inflammatory process of the lung. Therefore, it reduces the inflammation, improves the pulmonary function because the fluid of the lung will be reabsorbed, and then that improves the function of the lung and reduce mortality. These are the theories, and then these can be demonstrated by real cases Dr. Hare is going to present. So Dr. Hare.
So we recognized very early that there was this huge unmet need. And as early as late March, early April, started to receive requests for compassionate use / expanded access application of cell-based therapy. We worked with the FDA and have treated more than 12 cases of patients, which we have reported in the preprint server medical archive. And the link is here, and of course, we'd be happy to provide that article to you. These patients were treated largely at the University of Miami Health System, both of our hospitals in Miami, the Jackson Memorial Hospital and the UHealth Tower. We also have treated patients at the University of Maryland in Baltimore and Wake Forest University in North Carolina. The x-rays show two examples. Dr. Xu showed in the last slide how the lung fills with fluid due to the inflammation. And you can see that on the left sides of the slides. The rows are the same patient x-rayed at baseline, day 5, day 11, and day 15. You could see how the lung fields are white and opaque early on, and how there is a dramatic clearing over about the 2-week period. This correlated very nicely with the recovery of the patient's ability to exchange oxygen from the air into their lungs and be weaned off of the need for supplemental oxygen. So there was a real correlation with the clinical outcome. Now, our expanded access program had a subgroup of patients who had the most severe cases of COVID pneumonia. These patients were so severe that they had to be on a mechanical heart-lung machine to provide oxygen into their bloodstream. Of 9 of those patients, 7 fully recovered and were discharged from the hospital, which greatly exceeded the published reports of the survival rate of patients with similar degrees of illness. So this was about a 22% recovery rate compared to a published rate of only about 44%. Sorry, that's the mortality rate, a 22% mortality rate versus a 44% mortality rate, so a lot better. Now, the other thing we were able to show in the study was we were able to look at viral clearance and complications of the treatment. We showed that the treatment was very safe and that the virus cleared very rapidly, efficiently in a 2 to 3 week time frame. So we have on our hands what is potentially a safe and effective therapy that has a relatively low side effect profile that's also potentially effective in the most severe patients. Now, of course, this is a hypothesis at this point and requires confirmation in a placebo-controlled trial. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kurtzberg at this point. At this point, he'll tell you more about our trials and the fact that we have already an approved FDA IND to be able to begin a placebo-controlled study as appropriate. So Joanne, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Josh. So at Duke, back in March and April, we were successful in getting an IND approved to study infusions of cord tissue MSCs in adults with COVID ARDS. And this is a study for the sickest of patients. So these are patients who are intubated and in the ICU. And our IND allowed us to have 2 phases of the study. First, 10 patients sequentially treated in a phase 1 lead-in with 1 manufacturing site at Duke and 3 daily doses of 100 million cells, essentially, of the cord tissue MSCs when the patient was enrolled on the trial. The site has expanded to 5, or the trial has expanded to 5 clinical sites, and there are currently 7 patients enrolled, and the 8th is about to be added today. And what I can say is that the patients have all tolerated the therapy well to date. There have not been any safety issues, and we'll describe efficacy at the end of the trial. Now, after these first 10 patients are to be treated, we were going to move into a 20-patient randomized placebo-controlled phase with a 1-to-1 randomization. But because we were also aware of the work that Josh is doing at the University of Miami, and to accelerate this process overall, we're now going to join forces and take the patients I had permission to treat on our 20-patient 1-to-1 randomized placebo-controlled study and combine it with 20 patients Josh has approval to treat into a 40-patient phase 2 placebo-controlled trial using cord tissue MSCs, either manufactured at Duke or at the University of Miami by Josh, a fixed dose at the same schedule we tested in phase 1, and expanding to 8 clinical sites. So we hope to be able to initiate that in the next 4 to 6 weeks under the IND we already have filed with the FDA. And we hope to get an answer over the next, I would say, 3 to 4 months about whether we really can say not only that these cells are safe, but that there is a signal for efficacy using the cells in COVID ARDS. We're also going to expand the trial to allow patients who are sick, but not yet intubated, but requiring some kind of respiratory support, because the approach to treating COVID ARDS patients has changed over the last several months. And actually, intubation is the last ditch effort. And we believe if we treat patients earlier, we may be able to rescue and improve the course of even more patients. So in the next slide, I just want to comment that we get asked a lot of questions about whether cell therapies in general are scalable, and cell therapies for COVID ARDS specifically are scalable. And the answer is yes, both between the manufacturing at Duke and University of Miami with core tissue MSCs. We have the capabilities right now to manufacture the doses that are needed for the clinical trials we're proposing, as well as a much larger clinical trial if this small phase 2 shows a signal. Currently, our programs are manufacturing in flasks, which you can kind of see on the first column above the table. And with that, we can easily make about 700 doses a year. But if we move to something called a quantum bioreactor, which both laboratories already possess, we can increase to 6,000 to 10,000 doses a year. And we would hope, if this therapy can be funded, that there would be some money to develop even the most sophisticated type of manufacturing with very large bioreactors, which would get us to not only over 100,000 doses a year, but a reduced cost of those doses, because the bigger the lot you make, the less cost per dose you incur. So we hope that this will happen, and we know that this is feasible and not a reason to not be enthusiastic about this approach. Next slide, please. So one thing that's been, frankly, very disappointing is the level of federal investment in cell therapies, not only for COVID, but in general. And of the more than 10 billion in supplemental funding that Congress appropriated to BARDA and NIH for COVID-related vaccines and therapies, there have been no funds directed towards promising regenerative medicine cell therapies for patients with COVID-19. And of the 24 COVID clinical trials exploring the use of MSCs for COVID-19 patients in the United States, only one phase 1 trial, which is directed toward cancer patients who have COVID ARDS, is being funded by the NIH through the NCI. Less than 1/3 of the 1% of total less than 1/3 of 1% of total NIH funding has supported clinical trials for regenerative medicine cell therapies. The 30 million in funding for regenerative medicine cell therapy research provided through the 21st Century Cures Act expired on September 30th, 2020, and none of this funding was directed towards MSC therapies in any diseases. Philanthropic investments have helped us to get where we are today, and has funded, for example, the trials that both Josh and I are conducting right now in COVID ARDS. But to get to the next level and to do really robust, large, randomized phase 3 trials, federal investments are really needed. And there are examples of significant investments by states. The California voters just approved another $5.5 billion to invest in CERN and regenerative medicine cell therapies this November. And I'll turn the slides over to Maria Milan, who can tell you about the CERN program.
Thank you very much. We're going to shift gears a little bit, and I'm going to describe the investments that have been made in California, just to give a flavor for what could occur if there is specific investment into the regenerative medicine space. Next slide, please, Janet. So California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, as you heard, was formed from state initiatives that have funded stem cell research in California. The original formation of CERN was in 2004, and it was created through a citizen-led bond measure, which is a mechanism for state funding in California, that invested $3 billion into this area. At that time, this was just an extremely, the field was in its infancy, and there wasn't much investment into the area, and there was some at that point still a lot of controversy regarding what types of stem cell research could be conducted. But what's happened since then is our understanding of the various types of stem cell approaches has expanded. There have been significant amounts of progress in the field catalyzed by investment into the area. The $3 billion fund led to over 1,000 awards and 68 clinical trials, often first in human clinical trials using stem cell gene therapy for unmet medical needs. And then, as you heard, just this past year, because the initial bond initiative was only really supposed to cover about a 10-year period. It lasted a little bit longer than that. But this past year, Californians voted to invest $5.5 billion through another citizen-led bond measure, not only to conduct this important area of research, but also expand the probability of it reaching patients. So there's also provisions for being able to improve accessibility and affordability to get this to patients, especially those in disadvantaged areas. And in addition, there's also an emphasis on producing the workforce of tomorrow, as well as other type of associated efforts. Next slide, please. And that's just being launched now, but I would like to just go over what the initial $3 billion 2004 investment led to. So we have been able to craft a unprecedented acceleration-based funding model where meritorious programs are put through a very rigorous evaluation, and they're able to be funded in a very short period of time, and that allows the research to continue and not die on the vine as they're awaiting funding. And through this, as discussed earlier, we've been able to push forward to create a diverse technology platform portfolio, which involves gene therapy, multiple different types of cell therapies, including the MSCs, which you heard about, for a variety of indications, including childhood pediatric conditions such as a defect in the spinal cord called spina bifida. So we just funded that into the clinical phase. But we also funded a COVID program for MSC and ARDS, as described by Dr. Kurtzberg and Dr. Hare. We've been able, because there was dedicated funding to this and a critical mass of investigators, been able to align with and help bring forward the evolving FDA regulatory paradigm, and a great number of our programs have what's called the Regenerative Medicine Advanced Therapy designation, where both the FDA and the investigators are continuing to learn more on how to accelerate these programs forward in a safe manner. The funding has also led to creation of specialized infrastructure, such as clinical trial networks and scientific technology, such as a genomics hub and other types of translational hubs that will help these therapies get out into the clinical trials and into patients. We funded creation of education programs, which led to workforce development. There have been over 1,500 alumni in our funded programs, more than half of them first generation college students, and involving 60 host institutions in biotechnology and academic institutions. And patient advocates have been involved in every aspect of this. They're on our board, they're on advisory panels, and they're critical in terms of how we shape our programs. Next slide, please. This is just an overview of what the investments are in terms of the different areas in infrastructure, education, discovery research, which is where it all starts, translation to get that into the clinics, and then clinical trials. And just overall, the majority of those funds have funded the research itself. Almost $2.8 billion of that $3 billion was essentially for the research, and really limited, and we were able to make this work really well, even with a limited administrative budget. So very efficient. Next slide, please. And this has led, most importantly, to progressing 574 research and development level awards, with 68 first in human clinical trials mostly, and 25 translational programs. The translational programs are the ones that are building the pipeline to get into the clinics. And not going through all this, but you can see, I think you can see all the slides, that it targets currently incurable, untreatable conditions such as blinding eye diseases, some forms of neurodegeneration, Most recently, we were able to pivot and leverage this funding program to rapidly solicit and fund 17 high quality clinical trials, 17 COVID programs, including 3 clinical trials, one of which is in a multi-center trial using MSC for acute respiratory distress, lung injury. I wanted to just highlight and emphasize what was said earlier. There's been progress. There's now some kind of validation from pharma that there are legs for this type of technology, but we're nowhere close to done. There's a lot of science and a lot of research that still needs to be done to refine how these technologies, including MSC for lung injury, will be able to be a durable treatment. Next slide, please. And that's why CIRM and hopefully federal investments will go into this. Just wanted to point out that even though we're a California institution, it leverages to a more broad applicability. In fact, we have a landmark MOU with the NHLBI Institute of the NIH to essentially share processes, streamline processes, so we can rapidly identify and co-fund cell and gene therapy approaches for sickle cell, which is, as you may know, a genetic defect that afflicts mainly African Americans, but also other patients, and it results in a shorter lifespan and is marked with chronic hospitalizations, pain, and complications. And so this is a way that we're funding not just California, but co-funding across the country and sharing these resources and accelerating efforts on both sides, both federal and state level. Next slide, please. And what kind of a marker of that types of technologies in regenerative medicine do have a future, do have a path toward commercialization, is that over the years, in this slide, we can see from 2014 to 2020, the increasing amount of industry pull in terms of investments into CIRM-funded programs. When they first came to us, they had great science, but they didn't have yet enough data. And it was so new and so innovative and seemed out there that they initially don't get the typical investment through pharma and even NIH, frankly. And so we de-risk these programs. And then as they continue to make progress and get data, they gain confidence and then attract industry funding to the tune of now over $12 billion in industry partnerships. Most of those have been over the past several years. And Dr. Hare mentioned, not one of our programs, but the Mesoblast program gaining industry investment from Novartis. So I think that we have proof of concept that the technology platforms we're talking about need to be developed in academia in an early stage and need to be de-risked so that later on they're at a suitable stage that there are commercialization partnerships and further investment into it. Next slide, please. So the impact of California investment in CIRM funding is, as you can see, 68 first-in-human clinical trials, which may not have been able to get to that stage were it not for dedicated funding, with over almost 3,000 patients enrolled just in California. So they have access to these cutting-edge clinical trials. We've created specialized infrastructure, and because this is all an ecosystem, we're knowledgeable of what the challenges are and who the players are, able to do that in a coordinated fashion, built educational programs to build the future workforce of tomorrow, and an ecosystem, and served as a hub for partnerships toward transformative solutions. And just another kind of data set to look at is that we asked for an economic impact to be conducted of what CIRM funding of the research has done. That's not even taking into account any types of revenues from treatments, because those are just making their way through to the clinics. And from the USC Saul Price School of Public Policy, they determined that an estimated $15.4 billion in sales revenue for that $3 billion investment, $1.8 billion federal, state, and local taxes, and the creation of over 80,000 new jobs. So this is viewed also, in addition to advancing the science, as a source of economic stimulus. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Milan, and thank you, Dr. Hare, Dr. Chu, and Dr. Kurtzberg. So in summary, what you've heard today is that therapies are still needed for seriously ill patients with COVID-19, particularly those on ventilator support. Regenerative medicine and cell therapies, particularly MSCs, are showing tremendous promise. Large-scale randomized placebo-controlled clinical trials are needed to confirm early results, but the lack of federal funding serves as a key barrier. So, what actions are needed? At least some portion of federal funding devoted to therapeutics, either within a COVID relief bill or fiscal year 2021 appropriations, should be directed toward FDA-approved clinical trials for regenerative medicine and cell therapies for severely ill patients with COVID-19. Thank you for joining us. And if you'd like to learn more, you can visit www.allianceforcelltherapynow.org, or feel free to email me at jmarchabroda@allianceforcelltherapynow.org. Thank you again for joining.